Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements. Today I honor a request made in my Discord by some members to cover a piece called Contra State and Revolution by Chris Wright. That is not, to my knowledge, the same Chris Wright that came on my show a couple of years ago, who's also been a proponent of workers' councils and has written for all kinds of magazines, including Compact, although it might be, but I would be surprised. The timing doesn't really work well. I think this is an interesting bit of criticism. It was submitted by 2005 to Libcom. It is a critique of the Leninist conception of the state and state and revolution. It makes a few points I think are valid, and then kind of jumps the shark in the rethinking Marxist sense of the late 90s, early aughts, which in many ways was a project of the remnants of parts of the new left to deal with the failure of the new communist movement and the failure of the USSR in the 1990s. I think there's some points in here that are interesting, and I think there's some points in here that are just wrong, but I wanted to give it a fair shake. State and Revolution is my favorite piece of work by Lenin. I think it's one of the most conceptually clarifying things he ever wrote, even if it's never been delivered on entirely. Partly because it entails a pretty close reading with a few things I disagree with of the critique of the Goethe program and the critique of the Erfurt program. But we'll get into the problems I have with this piece as well as what I think it's insightful on. Well, let's just get into the piece. Let's get that as large as we can so you guys can read it. Contra State and Revolution, Chris Wright's critique of Lenin's conception of the state and the state and revolution. Contra State and Revolution. For many years, Lenin's State and Revolution served as a prime account of the Marxist understanding of the state outside of academic circles. It still kind of does, frankly. Although people like Domenico Lacerto and other people who are state forward, a lot of social democrats and analytic Marxists as well, have abandoned even this understanding of the state for Miliband's understanding, or for some Hegelian understanding of the state as a necessary enforcer of social contracts or something like this. This work has informed generations of Marxists with what appeared to be a basic analysis of the state and a definitive conception of communism. One of the most definitive, except for what's in, say, the Civil Wars in France, the Communist Manifesto, and most critically, the unpublished critique of the first draft program or the critique of the Goethe program. Other subsequent works fall into two categories. First, we have a sophisticated but often academic and definitely not popularly accessible works, such as Pashukanas, Palansis, and the German state derivative derivation debate, which such authors as Offa, von Brunmüller, Hurst et al., Bob Jessup, John Holloway, Werner Bonfield, Simon Clark, whose work I like, and so on. Second, we have more popular works which do not really go beyond State and Revolution or which fall short of it, such as works by Ralph Miliband, which is, the Miliband-Palansis debate's often heralded as the second biggest thing that people read, or a host of near-Marxists such as William Domhoff, which I haven't read. Oddly, in very little of the more sophisticated work do we find a direct critique of Lenin's work and its relationship to Marx. Few people have advanced such critiques, and often the debate has remained between academic Marxists. For example, the debate between Palansis and Miliband generated a whole revival of analysis of the state of Marxism, but the center of the tension became Palansis and Miliband. Yeah, it did. Later, the German state derivation debate picked up on Eugenie Pilsudski's book on Marxism and Law from 1924, but this seems to be as close to Lenin as most of these discussions get or got. Some of this may have to do with the fact that many academic Marxists have viewed State and Revolution as crude or simplistic. which I think is wrong. However, this appreciation misses two important issues. First, Lenin is not as crude as many people think. His work represents some of the most sophisticated development of Marxism on the state from that period. Only Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution and some of the polemics by Anton Pannekoek against Kautsky and Bernstein represent nearly as sophisticated approaches to the state from that time period. But they have a much more limited scope. Yes, they do. I would agree with that. Second, only Lenin's work reflects the problem of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The critique of the Goethe program, from here on referred to as the Goethe critique, and the Paris Commune in such detail. Lenin's book also has the merit of setting forth the most libertarian approach to the state that Lenin would ever put forth. Yeah, that's definitely true. And since we want to consider a work that has been central to the formation of the views of tens of thousands of Marxists, where else can we go? It would be like talking about the Leninist conception of party without discussing what is to be done, and yet it happens all the time. Yeah, no Lars Lee for this. Even Lars Lee's discussion of the Goethe critique is pretty weak here. Therefore, I'm going to make an attempt at a critique of state and revolution along several lines. First, I'm going to pick up Lenin's conception of the state and the capitalist state in particular. In the process, I'll have to discuss Engels' understanding of the state, as well as Lenin's approach that really comes from Engels. I'm not sure that I agree with that, not Marx. This is a common assertion of the New Left, and sometimes of Mega 2 scholars, like Heinrich and Kohei Seitos, which often seem to be speculative almost entirely and not justified in their new Marx lecture material or the actual archive work, although they'll hint that it is, but they won't tell you exactly where they found it. Even in the first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism by Seitos, you see a lot of the New Left accusations against Engels repeated. But he basically says that Marxism indicates that Marx meant the opposite of what Marx said. So, yeah. Lenin makes a series of claims about both the constitution of socialism, the first phase of communism, and the existence of the state. In both cases, Lenin refers heavily to Marx's civil war in France, which is where a lot of the stuff is, and the Goethe critique. But I think he fundamentally departs from these works. Okay, how? Third, I'm going to address the relationship between Lenin's conception of the post-revolutionary society and the question of party and consciousness. I will make brief comments on alternative conceptions of the relationship of revolutionary organizations to the revolution and the organs of workers' power. Finally, I'll ask some questions to think about in terms of developing a conception of revolution, starting from Marx's notion of fetishism and the idea that communism is a real movement struggle of the working class for the 21st century. That's ambitious. Lenin's conception of the state. Since Lenin begins state and revolution with an understanding of the state, it seems logical to start there as well. However, Lenin follows Engels in this approach to the state, and we must begin with the criticism of Engels. Lenin begins with the origins of the family, private property, and the state. Well, it's the longer work. Engels argues in this book that the state begins when classes begin. The division of society into classes gives rise to the state. However, this seemingly simple, obvious argument misses something essential. No state is ever a generic state. This is actually a fair point. All states exist as a state of a particular society, but Engels' approach does not start from there. He starts from the meta-category. Richard Gunn, in his article on Marxism and Philosophy, Capital and Class, issue 35, 1989, characterizes this abstraction as an empiricist abstraction that assumes a genus-species relationship with an actual historical states. In other words, we have a metaphysical object called the state, and we line up all the actually existing states under it in a hierarchy. So under the title of the meta-category called the state, we can line up slave states, feudal states, capitalist states, etc. So we have typologies of the state, but not particular typologies of the state. This is an interesting argument, and I think there's some merit to it. The state becomes a transhistorical abstraction and an a priori construction that defines whether such and such thing is a state. And that actually comes hard in early societies, figuring out what counts as a state and what doesn't. Much the way meta theory does, not ask, is it true that roses are red, but ask, what is truth? Engels asks, what is the state? And then proceeds to give us an answer. The special arm body of men organized to defend the interests of the ruling class. Sure. I mean, I think that's actually probably a fair enough view. Are a special armed body of men and the administrative apparatus needed to defend the interests of the ruling class as modified by Weber, picking up on Engels. This approach falls short of giving us the means to understand what is unique about the capitalist state, however. Does it really fall short? Maybe. We'll see. Any approach has the answer to the question, what makes this state a capitalist state? Engels and therefore Lenin's approach treats the state as an instrument of the ruling class, as an object, as a thing that exists and which is determined by its functions. This is where this is actually a good critique. The state is a capitalist state because capitalists control the state. How do they control the state? The capitalists control the state through corruption, through personal ties to the state, and alliances between state and capital. See Lenin Collected Works, Volume 25, pages 397 and 98. Capital places its representatives into the vessel of the state, thereby taking it over. Yeah, and that assumes that the state exists outside of class and class relations. Those representatives in turn get the position in the capitalist corporations after they serve their term, solidifying the linkage. This assumes that the state is an empty vessel until some class fills it with new content. But it is not. It is not an empty vessel and cannot be. And I think, actually, Lenin does recognize this in his citation, probably of Pannekoek, but he's inconsistent on it. Nevertheless, let's continue. An alternative approach to the state would have to recognize what is different about the capitalist state from other states. First, starting from Marx's notion of fetishism, the relations between people appear as relations between things mediated by people. We have to start with the state as a social relation, not as a thing. I mean, how reified do you want the social relation to be? When we talk about levels of abstraction, this is an issue here. Like, are states real? Are they real abstractions? Are they imagined communities? Are they, what are they exactly? Are they systems of law, bodies of armed fighting men? They seem to be all these things and yet not reducible to any one of them. Now, I have my own, I could explain this in a non-Marxist way about the way these concepts are mediated in social relations are always an emergence and all naming of those emergences are named off of social necessity, but are not metaphysically totally real. But that's not necessarily the way historical materialists would define this. However, it is interesting that Marx's notion of fetishism does actually hint at such a problem. This is me still talking. Back to the text. Engels and Lenin start from the reified state by treating it as a thing, a vessel, an instrument, whether they're starting from the social relations underlying the state. The state is actually made up of the codification of social relations in terms of law that are enforced by those armed bodies of men for the ruling class, but that law may precede the state, and that the social relations may also precede the state, which Engels and Marx would have no problem with. Second, having established a need not to reify the state, what makes a state a capitalist state? Well, you need to go more in there, right? You do. Anyway. Having established a need not to reify the state, what makes a state a capitalist state? Capital, based on separation of producers from the means of production and turning the labor of the producers into commodity, creates a separation between the market, the realm of free exchange, and production. This separation, however, also separates the means of dominating labor from the exploitation of labor power. The economic and political become separate. They both appear to be separate and then really become separate in that false appearance. Right? That's the nature of fetishization. Thus, there's no direct identity exists between capital and the state. The relation appears indirect, except when it doesn't, like the establishment of markets, the establishment of currency, the maintenance of the means of a market, which has costs, which usually requires the state to step in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, that's what the argument classically was. In their effort to make the link explicit, Lenin and Engels asked if capitalists directly control the state in various ways. But this only serves to further fetishize the linkage because it assumes the identity of the state and capital and appearance. But appearance and essence do not coincide in a fetishized world. And it is exactly this that Marx takes up in his conception of fetishism and dialectics. Lenin and Engels go from dialectical to a positive approach to the state, insofar as they ask what makes a state a capitalist state. I'm not sure that I follow that. I was with you for most of this about treating the state as a singular thing and not a collection of social relations and processes of which the thing can be said to represent, but is actually obscuring the reality of the social relations and processes, right? The state is not a unitary singular subject or a singular thing. That's true. We've talked about this before in regards to Benjamin Studebaker. Thirdly, Lenin and Engels then proceed to adopt a functionalist attitude towards the state. The state becomes nothing more than its functions, the protection of the general interest of capital. Yeah, that is a little interesting. Once the state becomes a thing, an instrument, then we have reified the state, therefore making the state more stable than it actually is. And I think this is important. If we start from fetishism, however, the state exists as a form, a mode of existence of the capital-labor relation. The state has to be the project of struggle, which means the state cannot be defined by a predetermined series of functions. The function becomes a product of class struggle. The constitution of a state becomes a constant process, a process of constantly constituting a state that is fought over and reflects class struggles and intra-class struggles. And I think this misses this. Part of the need for the state as an armament invention is not just the suppression of the subordinate classes, but it is also the deliberation of unreconcilable conflicts within the ruling classes themselves, both within different ruling classes, such as political class versus the capitalist class, if the capitalists are not explicitly part of the political class, but also between different segments or sections of the capitalists themselves. The capitalist state was not simply construed with bourgeois revolutions or with absolutism, as Lenin discusses. I think that's true. Class struggle constantly constitutes and reconstitutes the state as a fetishized social relation, which is why dealing with the state is always a moving target. And again, see Benjamin Studebaker's piece on misapprehending the state as a unified thing with similar interest. We see not only in the formal division of government in the West, but in the way bureaucracies, even in more autocratic regimes, fight with each other. All right. Why? Because it's a contested social set of social relations that are represented in bureaucracy, etc. Finally, we have to ask, can we talk now about the capitalist state in the face of so many specific capitalist states? Because capital is global, has always been global from its origins in privacy, slavery, and conquest. Yes, it has, by the way. Although it has a singular or several singular political origins, it has always expanded beyond those political boundaries. The political, as a social relation, is also global. Yes, I agree. We can see each state as simply the fragmenting of the political into localities. Thus, the fracturing revolves around two relations: the need to control the movement of labor and the need to attract capital. This is true. Capital moves with varying degrees of mobility depending on whether capital moves as productive capital, commodity capital, or money capital. It mostly moves as money capital, by the way, but sometimes it moves as productive capital, and only settles where conditions appear attractive. For the extraction of surplus value, hence globalization. A contradiction that develops between the mobility of capital and the immobility of the state. Insofar as capital exists as a global capital, national capital is really a fiction, and despite what a lot of people want to tell you, including many leftists. The identification of capital with a particular capitalist class with a particular capitalist state makes no sense. I cannot go in depth here, but this approach would be seriously undermine the concept of state monopoly capitalism, which Lenin also depends upon and develops, which he gets largely from Bukharin. And I actually do think there is some evidence with the state that what Bukharin was talking about was real, that the state was mitigating tensions between capitalists by granting monopolies and turning capitalists back into quasi-rentiers as early as the beginning of the 20th century, which also makes the techno-neo-feudal thesis makes no sense, since the process it describes is in the process of capitalist governments the entire time, or at least since the late 19th century. Lenin's state is ultimately a national state, as is his capital, and the world is a state system where some states exploit others. This leads to things like the proletarian state theory. In a theory starting from fetishism, each state exists as a fragment, a fractured moment, a political as a global totality. As a result, exploitation is not between imperialist states or colonial or neo-colonial states, but between the exploitation of global labor by global capital. I think it's not that simple. I do think that there is both exploitation, both within the states and between imperialist states. And I do think Lenin's focus on imperialism can be vulgarly reduced to things like third worldism, as if states were the only actors. But it's simply, to me, not true that there's no exploitation between imperialist states and colonial or neo-colonial states. There is there, but that is an extension of comparative advantage between capitalists, which means there is both the exploitation of the proletariat by the capitalists in general, even in the colonial, neo-colonial states within themselves, as long as they are still capitalists and if they're subjects of the capitalist system and have markets and accumulation and banks, and they are. But also that this leads to comparative disadvantage between different capitalist states in the world system. I don't think this actually settles the process. This is too binary a choice. In the end, even though Lenin says that the state needs to be smashed, and he takes a revolutionary political position relative to the capitalist state, his theory reflects that of the Second International. I mean, there's a whole lot of ways in which Lenin does not actually depart from Kautsky, despite calling him a renegade, which largely, and a lot of people around, say, the CPGB Provisional Committee, don't even think it's a bad thing. In turn, we could just as correctly say that Lenin's mechanics of capitalism control the state only differ terminologically from G. William Dunhoff and other perceptive liberals critics of the state as an elite institution. But what does this really mean for our understanding of revolution? In the next section, I will lay out the differences between Marx and Lenin and their understanding of the term dictatorship of the proletariat and communism, and I'm guessing this is going to pull a lot from Hal Draper. The dictatorship of the proletariat and communism in Lenin and Marx. Several problems interest us here. How do Lenin and Marx understand the term dictatorship of the proletariat? What is the relationship between the dictatorship of the proletariat and communism? How did Lenin interpret Marx's discussion of the two phases of communism and critique of the Goethe program? Does Lenin have a concept of communism as a self-emancipation of the working class, as a free association of producers? All of Lenin's earlier work, and most of what comes later, understands the dictatorship of the proletarian to mean a particular dictatorial type of state, whose task is the repression of the capitalist class after revolution. We should be clear. Lenin, unlike in other places, does not consistently deploy this usage. He sometimes deploys the term as Marx used it. So how did Marx understand the phrase? In an extensive discussion of the term dictatorship of the proletariat from Marx to Lenin, Hal Draper makes a powerful argument that Marx does not understand the term as indicating a particular kind of state, but as a social dictatorship of the working class. Sure. In the same way, Marx would refer to all capitalist states and even all capitalist societies as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, so he referred to the dictatorship of the proletariat. In fact, if you read a handful of places where Marx uses the phrase, the meaning is quite apparent. I agree with this, actually. I agree with Draper. Second, Marx did not use the phrase often. The handful of times he uses it, Draper clearly points out its political edge in reference to the Blanquist and anarchist. The term actually originates with Auguste Blanqui and his followers. Yeah, it's a Blanquist theory. Marx used the term in the discussion, but he argued against the Pontius notion of the social revolution, a notion that Lenin dangerously comes close to. I've kind of thought that at times myself, but we'll come back. At best, we can say that Lenin sometimes takes the phrase in Marx's sense, but even in State and Revolution, he is inconsistent. In almost all his other work, Lenin consistently gets it wrong. I would love citations, bro. I would believe you if there are citations. I've read a ton of Lenin, and I do see what you're talking about here, but I wouldn't necessarily just say that without proving it. Anyway, the difference reflects another problem. While both Marx and Lenin see the working class as revolutionary, they do so for entirely different reasons. I don't know that I agree with this. For example, Lenin quotes his passage from Engels as gospel. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon the present anarchy in production, with its collisions and excesses and rising from the struggle, are removed, nothing remains to be held in subjection, nothing necessitating a special coercive force as state. Heroin, Derick's Revolution in Science, Anti-Derick. Pages 301 to 303, third German edition, quoted in Lenin, Collected Works, volume 25, page 400. Note how Engels associates capitalist oppression with the anarchy of production without ever discussing Marx's central critique of capitalism, the separation of the producer from the means of production. Compare this to Lenin. Because Engels thought it was obvious, I think. The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, this particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare for the task and provide it with the possibility and power to perform it. Yet, this is why we're not just valorizing the victim. While the bourgeoisie breaks up and disintegrates the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, sometimes, they will together unite and organize a proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all the working and exploited people, whom the bourgeoisie exploit, oppress, and crush, often not less but more than they do the proletarians, who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their emancipation. Collected Works, volume 25, page 408, italics are the authors, not Lenin's. Lenin takes a position that proletarian is an emancipatory class because of its role in large-scale production. Actually, Marx kind of does too in Das Kapital. This confuses a particular historical organization of labor power for the key relations between labor and capital. Lenin never grasped Marx's discussion of alienated labor and fetishism. Oh, I don't know that he doesn't, bro. The emancipatory power of the proletariat comes from the fact that the working class exists as a negation of property of exploitation. But these two things are related, Chris. Anyway, the total separation of the producer from the means of production. Under capital means that the working class has no possible existence as a propertied, i.e. exploiting class. Yes, particularly if you're limiting capital to productive capital or commodity capital, and not potential capital such as partially owning a home. The particular organization of alienated labor is secondary to the specific mode of existence of labor under capitalism. This matters simply because two different perspectives lead to two different views of revolution. For Lenin, and partially for Engels, I want more proof. The phrase of communism is taking over the current production process by the working class, the management of the existing production relations by the workers' state. For Marx, the first came of communism means the free association of labor, the abolition of the separation of producers from the means of producing, i.e. the abolition of relations of property. I think that's somewhat true. What Marx considers the most basic preliminaries to communism, precursor fulfilled in the course of revolution, with the exploitation of the exploitators, Lenin considers to be the first phase of communism. Gonna need more citations. Lenin completely misunderstands Marx's critique of the Goethe program and the discussion of the two stages of communism. I don't know that he does. For Marx, there's no stage of communism with a state or commodity production or wage labor. Lenin completely confuses the problem of the period of revolutionary overthrow of the first stage of communism. Lenin phrases it this way. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and lead to the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and the semi-proletarians, and the work of organizing a socialist economy. Collected Works, volume 25, page 409. In doing so, Lenin breaks with Marx in the second half of the sentence. Up until that point, Lenin could argue that he represented Marx's view. Lenin highlights his confusion of the revolutionary period with the first phase of communism in the quote below. In striving for socialism, however, we are convinced that it will need to develop into communism, and therefore the need for violence against people in general, for the subordination of one man to another and of one section of the population to another will vanish altogether, since people will become accustomed to observing elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination. Collected Works, volume 25, page 461. Clearly, Lenin still sees the first phase of communism as one of the subordination. I'm not sure that's what that says, because it can only see it in terms of capturing state power and the stratification of private property. Lenin goes on to say that in the first phase of communist society, usually called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, i.e. only in respect to the means of production. Bourgeois law recognizes them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them to the common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois law disappears. The socialist principle, he does not work, shall not eat, is already realized. The other socialist principle, an equal amount of products for an equal amount of labor, is also already realized, but this is not yet communism, and it does not yet abolish bourgeois law, which gives unequal individuals in return for really unequal amounts of labor, equal amounts of products. Collected Works, volume 25, page 472. This utterly contradicts Marx, does it? Marx says a bourgeois right, not law, which would assume the state. Lenin focuses on the economic revolution, which solely from the technical side, from the means of production, unlike Marx, who focused on relations of production, the separator of the producer from the means of production. Sometimes. I'm going to give that a sometimes. The idea that socialism merely equals the conversion of bourgeois private property into common property completely misunderstands Marx. Well, or even Engels, and you're trying to bring this in Engels because Engels talks about the difference between nationalization and socialization all the time, particularly in a critique of the Airfare program, although it's not a huge part of it. For Marx, private property means capitalist property as a whole, as in the total property of the capitalist class, not simply juridically reorganized individual property. State capitalism turned individual property into common property without ever violating private property, i.e. capitalist property. See Paresh, Chattopadhyay, I don't know how to say that. Paresh Chattopadhyay. The Marxist Conception of Capital and Soviet Experiments, Prager, 1994. I have no idea. For those of you who are listening, that is Chattopadhyay, and it's an Indian name. Therefore, Lenin posits a different form of capitalism, since none of the social relations of production change under. Yeah, but Lenin knew what state capitalism was and actually talked about it and maybe the need for it. Change under socialism. Lenin even contraposes the state to the working class here in the most libertarian work. Following two paragraphs highlight how far Lenin is from Marx. We are not utopians. We do not dream of dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based on the incomprehension of the task of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism. I don't know that they're totally alien, but they are kind of alien. And as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No. We want the socialist revolution with the people as they are now. The people who cannot dispense with the subordination, control, and foremen and accountants. Collected Works, volume 25, page 430. We, the workers, shall organize large-scale production on the basis of what capitalism has already created, relying on our own experience as workers, attracting strict iron discipline backed up by state power of armed workers. We will reduce the role of the state officials to simply that of carrying out our own instructions as responsible, revocable, modestly paid foremen and accountants, of course, with the aid of technicians of all sorts and types and degrees. A witty German social democrat of the 70s of the last century called the postal service an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true. Ouch. Never like this. At the present state of the postal service is a business organized along the lines of state capitalist monopoly. Imperialism is only gradually transforming all trust into the organization of a similar type. Yeah, except it isn't so much now. But anyway, that's not a repudiation of Lenin. That's a repudiation of people who refuse to think that anything's changed since 1917. And which, standing over the common people who are overworked and starved, one has the same bourgeois bureaucracy. But the mechanism of the social management is already to hand. We have overthrown the capitalists, crushed the resistance of these exploiters with the iron hand of the armed workers, and smashed the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state. We shall have a splendidly equipped mechanism free from the parasite, a mechanism which very well be set to going into united workers themselves, who will hire technicians, foremen, and accountants, and pay them all, as indeed all state officials in general, workmen's wages. Everyone gets paid the same, getting their hours in, even the specialists. Here is a concrete, practical task which can be immediately fulfilled in relation to all trust, a task whose fulfillment would rid the working people of exploitation, a task that takes account of what the commune had already begun to practice, particularly in building up the state. To organize the whole economy on the lines of the postal service so that technicians, foremen, and accountants, as well as all officials, shall receive salaries no higher than a workman's wage under the control and leadership of the armed proletariat, that is our immediate aim. I mean, I wish they had done that in totality, honestly. They tried to, though. This is what will bring about the abolition of parliamentarianism and the preservation of representative institutions. This is what will rid the laboring classes of bourgeois prostitution of these institutions. Collected Works, volume 25, page 430 to 431. We must go into further and say Lenin completely misunderstands Marxist discussion of bourgeois right on the first phase of communism, believing that Marx means the continued existence of wage labor. I'm going to say here that I'm actually sympathetic to this critique. This critique was first made by Bordiga, but I think it's actually true that what Marx is referring to is time accounting. And the reason why we know it's not wage labor is because even in the early phases, he's talking about labor tokens, which is not really wage labor. The first phase of communism already assumes the end of money and the wage relation. It assumes the end of the state and the capital's relations of production. I think this is actually a fair critique of the talk about paying them the same. Although what he means is they're not going to get any more labor tokens than anyone else. I think that's what Lenin means, but I might be correcting Lenin to make him more right. I don't know. Both phases of, but I know that Bordiga thought that Lenin was in line with him. Both phases of communism depend on what Marx called the free association of producers, in which the freedom of each is a precondition for the freedom of all, just like Bakunin. Does this mean that Marx did not believe that the proletariat needed a state, albeit a transitional, immediately dying state, to suppress the capitalist fast? First, Marx clearly does have some kind of transient form of state in mind, but the state exists only as long as the exploitation of the expropriators continues. It has nothing to do with the first phase of communism, what Lenin and others refer to as socialism. Maybe. Second, Marx does not conceive of a particular state form as dictatorial, as in the dictatorship in the modern sense as I have indicated elsewhere, while leaving the question of a specific form of the state open. At most, we can say the commune formed the core of his conception. A form certainly has none of the features of a dictatorship in the modern sense of the term. Yeah, but Marx was critiquing the commune. A few of Marx's more status quotes suffice to make the point, as his writing in the Civil War of Lance and the North of Adolf Wagner lean even more unambiguously in an anti-statist direction. Marx comments as follows. This is Marx quote. In depicting the most general phase of development of the proletariat, we trace more or less a veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation and sway of the proletariat. Long ellipses. We see the above as a first step in revolution by the working classes to raise the proletariat to position the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie and centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Productive forces is important for Marx. It's just not the only important thing. People who make it out to be you either have productive forces or relations of production are really bastardizing this problem. Pages 31 and 34 of the Communist Manifesto, 7th German edition, 1906, quoted in Lenin, Collected Volume Works, page 25, page 407. Quote, if the political struggle of the working class assumes revolutionary form, wrote Marx, ridiculing anarchists for their repudiation of politics as if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in the place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs and the crushed resistance of the bourgeoisie. They give the state a revolutionary and transient form instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state. News Zeitun, volume 32, issue 1, 1913 and 1914, page 40, quoted in Lenin, Collected Work, volume 25, pages 440 to 441. Italics not in the original, but those of you who are listening can hear that. Between capitalist and communist society lies a period of revolutionary transformation of one thing into another. Corresponding to this political transition, a period of which a state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Critique of the Gotha program, Marx quoted in Lenin, Collected Works, volume 25, page 464. Question of party and consciousness. I'm not sure you actually totally proved your point, right? Lenin's conception of the party depends on the notion of consciousness that he derives from Kautsky and the Second International. Yes. And I think Lars Lee makes this very clear in his book on what is to be done. Obviously, Lenin makes a connection clear in what is to be done, then makes the claim that the working class cannot get beyond trade union consciousness to revolutionary consciousness without an external intervention by the party. Revolutionary consciousness comes from outside the class struggle, from the development of science. Yeah, I've never understood this either. I never thought it was very valid. For a critique of this view, see Open Marxism, volume 1 through 3, Bonefeld, Gunn, Psychopedis et al., 1993 to 1994. I don't know that I love open Marxism, actually, as an answer to all these problems. Many people would have claimed that Lenin goes beyond that perspective at a different moment, such as State and Revolution. Supposedly, Lenin takes a different perspective on the question of the self-emancipation of the class. Can we support this view? I don't know. I think we kind of can. I don't think so. Okay, well, you disagree with me. Lenin continues to view the development of class consciousness in a mechanical way that assumes the party as a necessary catalyst and embodiment of class consciousness. Lenin clarifies the role of the party in State and Revolution in the following way. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming power and leading the whole people to socialism, of directing, organizing the system, and being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all working and exploited people, and organizing their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. Lenin, Collected Works, volume 25, page 430. Why question mark? I don't get why the question mark there. This conception of the role of the party still very much places the role of the bearer of consciousness upon the party as opposed to the working class. I don't know, it could be a dialectical relationship emerging between both and their merger, maybe. The party exists as an educator, the bearer of special knowledge and technique. Yeah, but where do they learn the technique from? Of course, we have the right to ask, where does this privileged information come from, this privileged knowledge, when it asks us clearly the positive science of Marxism. I never really bought that either, but still. But we have a few problems. Marx does not posit his ideas as the positive science of the world. Well, he does sometimes, actually. When Marx uses the term science, Wissenschaft, he uses it in a negative way, indicating a ruthless critique of everything existing in the Holy Family, page unmarked. But my favorite, sense. But Marx also talks about science all the time. For Marx, dialectics always means negative dialectics. I'm not sure that's true. Although a lot of people think so. Engels is the first person to fail to grasp this, and upon his partial mistakes through a whole positivistic treatment of dialectics, which Lenin fully absorbs. Bullshit. Marx could have easily corrected Lenin at any time, and as Tarcell Carver points out, he doesn't. He encourages him. I mean, not Lenin. Engels at any time. He doesn't. He encourages him. This idea that there's some real tension between Engels and Marx, while there's a difference in focus, and Marx often actually had Engels write his geopolitical commentary and stuff for him, it's just not true that there's a fundamental separation between the two. Even Alvin Gouldner in the 70s saw that this new left myth was not true. Therefore, Lenin's notion of Marxism stands juxtaposed to Marxist Marxism. Everyone does this as an out, and it's a bad out. Nor can we find a space outside of class struggle, outside of alienation and fetishization, to which to claim this positive science. This, I think, is a more valid point. In Marx, we find no outside to the capital-labor relation, no privileged distance, objective space from which we can turn the working class or our own activity or anything else into a pure object of study. This is true. I think this is actually fair. This first part, kind of bullshit. The second part, not. Because capital is nothing but alienated labor. Labor and capital. Capital has no existence separated from labor. No, it has an existence as dead labor. But I guess it's still connected to labor. Just not obvious labor going on right now. But because labor means nothing under capital except as alienated labor, because capitalism exists as a separation of producers from the means of production, labor also exists against capital. That's not the only thing capital is, though. This reveals an interconnected relation of antagonism, but an asymmetrical one. Capital needs labor, but labor does not need capital. Labor needs capital as in the means of production, but it doesn't need capital as a system. Labor exists in and against and beyond capital simultaneously. It also emerges from it. It can't emerge without it. Dude. In Marx, revolutionary consciousness has a special privilege of the working class, not a party of intellectuals or even a vanguard of the working class militants. Marx does talk about the most advanced sections of the proletariat, bro. The working class, rent by antagonism of being in and against capital, is the only class as a whole in the position to see through the process of fetishization. That's true, according to Marx, but I don't think that actually stands to reason that there's no talk of vanguard. He doesn't use that word, but he does talk about the advanced sections of the proletariat. It is exploitation and alien labor, not scientific socialist ideas, which lead to revolutionary class consciousness as a whole. But the scientific socialist ideas emerge from exploitation and alienated labor. They're not binary like this. Marx's notion of self-emancipation of the working class and his notions of organization, as stated in Communist Manifesto, his work in the International Working Men's Association, and his letters towards the end of his life, including the Goethe critique, indicate a different notion of consciousness from Lenin. This conception of the formation of consciousness implies a wholly different concept of state and revolution. It applies a wholly different concept to organizations. Well, but what concept? What concept? You need to define this, Mr. Wright. If I am right, then Lenin's organizational concept embodies a departure from Marx's approach to the problems of consciousness, his organization. Then where do we begin? Well, what if you're not right? What if this is not that clear? I don't think it's that clear. For example, I don't think the vanguard notion is totally foreign to the idea of the advanced sections of the working class joining with the socialist movement, with the working class in the lead. That is Marx's notion. If you have a problem with the notion of party as external to class, it's because it's the intellectuals in the lead, not in movement with the working class. But even Lenin thinks the working class should ultimately be put in charge. After all, it's supposed to be their state run by them. Whether or not they achieve that is an entirely different question, but nonetheless, that is the proposition on the table. If I am right, then Lenin's approach to organizational concepts embodies a departure from Marx's approach to the problem of consciousness and its organization. Then where do we begin? Well, I don't know if you're right. First, we need to engage in the serious re-examination of non-Leninist forms of organization, even those that ultimately fail, like most of them, including the Leninist form, really. I mean, there's some actually existing socialist states that exist, but not many. In that sense, they have all failed, but some have failed better than others. The council communists drew and developed the question of workers' councils, even if they made a fetish of the council at a certain point. They made a fetish of the council very quickly. And this was Bordiga's point against them, and the communizationers picked this up. Ultimately, they seemed to decide that revolutionary organizations should dissolve themselves in the councils and not propose a separate existence from the workers' organs of power after a revolution. And I sort of think there's something here. Marxist humanism. This is Marxist hyphen humanism as opposed to Gramsci. This is Dunyaskaya and Kevin Anderson and his opposing organization, Andrew Kleiman and co. And socialism are barbarism, develop different conceptions of organization opposed to the idea of vanguardism. Yeah, although they kind of operate as vanguardist parties anyway, but with a strong emphasis on theory and practice unity, even if they diverge at critical points. Yeah, but it would be important to talk about what those points are. The Situational Rationalist International developed an important critique of militantism that we also see in certain left communists later, but they also developed a council position on the role of the Marxist organization in the workers' councils, projecting a purely negative anti-bureaucratic role, but one continues after the revolution. Solidarity in England took a mixture of ideas from different groups and developed a series of ideas worth further investigation. I'd love to know what they are. I only mention here what have been critical interventions for me, and each of us hopefully brings another examples and ideas to the table. I mean, we should bring ideas from Leninism too, frankly, if you're going to do this and put it all back on the table. Second, we might be asking, since revolutionary consciousness develops in the course of class struggle, but Marxism does not spring into every revolutionary worker's head, what is the role of Marxists? We could do worse than to return to Marx. Simple comments in the Communist Manifesto on the role of communists in the workers' movement as a part of our rethinking. Degrading Marxist organizational theory and practice form the essential part of Leninism, especially post-Lenin Leninism. Okay, so I guess this is after Stalin and Trotsky. But how? How does it do this? I mean, this is actually separate from what was argued above, and I'm not totally convinced of what was argued above, bro. Does that condemn us to a contemplative position? It did not do so for Marx, so I do not think it should do so for us either. We have to ask, what do we, as revolutionaries, do? The attraction of Leninism was always that it had the answer, even if it was the wrong answer. Towards the conception of revolution. I have not addressed the problem of the Bolsheviks in power, even the October. Even though I thought about it, and such a discussion is implicit in this whole article. Yeah, but it's only implicit in a vague way. That would require considerably more space than we have here. Yes, it would. At best, I can comment on a series of works that people should refer to, each of which captures a part of what I see in developing the further critique of Leninism, especially Leninism in power. Yeah. Instead, I would like to draw some conclusion. First, I don't think we can defend the idea that Lenin develops a coherent Marxist analysis of the state. whether he develops a view that suffers from strong themes of functionalism and positivism. I think the functionalism is fair. Second, Lenin's notion of revolution has little in common with Marx's conception of revolution as the self-emancipation of the working class. I just don't believe that. I think Lenin's notion of revolution is slightly different than what we have articulated in Marx, but it's not completely different and has little in common. Now, they both are concerned about the working class coming to terms with scientific ideas and manifesting both their own power and driving them together. Now, maybe Lenin has a more state-centric view of that, even in State and Revolution. Marx, however, is undoubtedly a centralist and was not against electoral work, even though he was against forming electoral coalitions and bourgeois governments. His exact line on electoralism is from the letters is actually really hard to parse, because we get his turn against the anarchists, anti-electoralism, and in his polemization against them and the First International, but we also get his anger at the proto-SPD and early SPD at forming coalitions with bourgeois governments. Or, he did not like that, and basically said that, that the role of electoral socialists should mostly be to weaken the bourgeois state. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of that exactly, but that's what the letters in the polemics indicate. Anyway, where Lenin is right, he says nothing that we could not already get from Marx. But I mean, Lenin would say that. Lenin would say he's just explicating Marx. Generally misunderstands Goethe critique. He might misunderstand on one point, dude. His whole discussion of communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat is a departure from Marx and an extension. Even Hal Draper didn't agree with you on that. Lenin rather extends a line of thought we could refer to as Lassalleanism, with his fetishization of the state. Well, I guess the only thing I could say you can say in Lenin that's explicitly Lassallean is the democratic centralism, which does go back to Schweitzer, who was a Lassallean, and not to Marx, who was a centralist, but not a democratic centralist, and not anti-democratic. That specific formulation was something that you could kind of get to from Marx, but the way it was employed in Lassalle was very different. But that's the version that's maintained in the Second International, and that's the version that is further expanded upon and codified in the Third International. By the way, democratic centralism does not begin with Lenin. In other words, we do not just have to go beyond Lenin, we have to abandon Leninism to the dustbin of history. We have to start from somewhere else entirely. I might argue that we have to deal with Leninism as a particularity of Russia in the early 20th century, which is not applicable today in every way, but I'm not willing to just throw it to the dustbin of history, no. And that's not even because I'm an explicit Leninist. I just think this is a bad way of doing thought. Does this mean we go back to Marx? We have new questions to ask, we have new experience to assimilate. I agree, but yeah. The word has not stood still since Marx, and neither has revolution, but re-examining some of the problems Marx grappled with, as Marx grappled with them, would help us reformulate a different Marxism, what John Holloway, Werner Bonfield, and Richard Gunn et al. Called open Marxism. Taking power without taking power and all that nonsense, yeah. Certainly after the 20th century, we can no longer look about power and revolution in the same terms. I actually agree with that, but I don't agree with how you think you're probably going to do this. We cannot say, look at what the communards did, at least no more than we can afford to ignore the ad experience. I do not claim to have any answers, but I have questions. So I'm not going to propose some new conception of revolution here, so much as I want to pose a series of points that may help us collectively develop that conception. Central to the discussion has been the notions of the state and how we understand it. Holloway, Bonfield, Simon Clark, and others have begun vital work, which I need to pick up and develop. We have to go beyond the generic state or the state as an instrument of an object external to the capital labor relation. I agree with this, actually. I think this is a good point to think about. I cannot elaborate this approach here beyond a few things that I've said in this article. Well, I would love for you to have elaborated on this more. 2, in discussing the problem of working class revolution, we have to reopen the discussion of forms of workers' power we have seen, especially factory councils and workers' councils. Not that this discussion has ever exactly ended. It didn't end in the Soviet Union, even way after Lenin and Stalin, etc. But it became a minority discussion within Marxism. I'm adding the within there, on the fringes of the Leninist-dominated discussion, which assumed it knew all the answers. We must ask if the concept of smashing the state really appreciates the whole problem of the relationship of revolution adequately. We need to reopen the contours of what revolution, starting with the recognition we no longer know what it looks like, having mistaken one type of revolution for another in Russia, and so much that we have seen a restoration of capitalism, and having seen relatively few in a world that has drastically changed in the last 30 years. We saw a bunch up in the 1970s. We don't see as many now. We have to grapple with the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. First, do we want to use the term anymore? I'm not sure I agree with banning it. I think when you read Balabar's attempt at banning it, it gets weird. It's already seemed to be outdated in Marx's time, and Engels proposed talking about the revolutionary state not as a state, but as the German word for commune. See his letter to Babel from 1875, dealing with the topic, quoted in State Revolution, in the section of Marx's critique of the Goethe program. I do sometimes wish that this guy Wright quoted more than just the stuff that's quoted in State and Revolution itself. Yeah. Beyond that, though, we have to ask, what if transient state, as Marx cards it, will be necessary barrier which we must overcome, or a deadly detour from which no revolution can recover? AKA, get back to the Bakunin Marx debate, I guess. How do we understand communism? We have Marx's insight, his discussion after the commune. We have a wide range of non-Leninist figures to draw from, and dare I say it, we need to revisit anarchism in a serious way. I do think we need to revisit anarchism in a serious, but not uncritical way. After all, anarchism itself seems to be very different from what it was in the early 20th century, and I don't know that it's always that great. We need to revisit the problem of the organization and the role of revolutionaries. I pose this question above, but only in the brief outline. These are simply some provisional questions and suggestions, but maybe it's where we need to begin. Not only do we no longer have all the answers, we never had all the answers, we have to reckon with the fact that we never did. Okay, good. We have to try our best to see Marx with fresh eyes and rediscover revolution. I think we have to try our best to see all this with fresh eyes, including the material conditions. Chris Wright, May, June 2001. I think it's interesting that this is from what we can consider the end of the 90s and American socialist thought, because it's right before 9/11. And this is a particularly low period for any form of Marxism, Leninist or otherwise, with only the ISO seemingly ascendant at the time and really developing in contrast with both non-Marxist social democratic, in the non-classical sense of that term, and anarchist movements in the 90s, particularly in the Anglophone West, but also even in continental Europe. After post-Marxism and whatever the fuck Foucault was on to, and. I think this, however, is maybe throwing too much out of Lenin. I know a lot of people would want me to take a more anti-Leninist or clearly pro-Leninist stance, but I think Lenin is a much more mercurial figure than that. And we need to not strawman him. And while I do think the idea of the state as an empty vessel plagues Marxism, against Marx's own conception of these things as fetishized relations that are constantly moving, I think that's a fair critique, but that's a critique deeper than just Lenin. In fact, it would hit many anti-state Marxists as well. I think we should take all this more seriously. But this is somewhat symptomatic of the time period we were in after the fall of the Soviet Union, of which this was not even a decade out from. Remember, when I was 21 years old, the Soviet Union had only not existed for 9 years. I remember when the USSR was a thing. How fast the ghosts accumulate, and how fast does the nostalgia. Like and subscribe, hit the bell if you want more discussions like this and other discussions. You can find more behind the Patreon for as little as $3. But if you don't, just go to the Buzzsprout show. We can find on any podcast aggregate and share that. Leave a review. And just generally support my work. I am doing less work these days, but I'm still doing both an interview and at least one of these episodes a week, and occasionally other things. And there's other shows behind the paywall, but most of the stuff I try to provide for free. I've had to slow down my production from literally every day of the week to 2 to 3 days a week, just for my job's sake and for health and for my writing practice. And I hope you guys continue to support me. But if you don't, I understand. But support me anyway. Also, join a union if you can. Be involved in socialist organizations. Continue with the work of the workers' movement if you're a worker, or even if you're not one. And continue learning. But most importantly, keep your sanity and your peace. Take care.